I discovered my husband's affair happening in our bedroom at 9:38 p.m. But what I'll never forget isn't the laughter from the second floor, nor the red high heels belonging to a strange woman sitting beside the front door. What I'll never forget is my mother-in-law, Eleanor Whitmore, sitting in the living room below, keeping watch for them with a cup of tea in her hand. She didn't flinch when I walked in, didn't stand up, didn't pretend to be flustered like someone caught concealing filth inside her own daughter-in-law's home. Eleanor simply raised her eyes to look at me, smiled very slightly, as though I were the one who had appeared at the wrong moment. On the coat hook near the staircase, that woman's champagne-colored silk scarf hung right beside Michael's jacket. From the second floor came the low sound of his laughter, then a female voice, soft, young, and far too comfortable to belong to a guest. I stood still, not because I was in pain, but because I was cataloging the scene. Eleanor set her teacup down on the glass table. "Claire," she said slowly, "you're home earlier than I expected." I looked at her. "You knew she was up there." "Of course," she answered immediately, with a composure that bordered on pride. "I'm the one who let her in." That sentence was dropped like a blank sheet of paper placed on a signing table. No trembling, no shame, no concealment. Eleanor wanted me to hear it clearly, wanted me to understand this was not an accident, but an arrangement. She tilted her head, eyes brightening when she saw I didn't react. "Don't make a scene," she said. "Michael has been under enough pressure." I asked, "Pressure from betraying his wife in their own home? Pressure from living with a woman who cannot give him a child?" Eleanor lifted her teacup, blowing on it lightly even though the tea had gone cold. "An infertile wife should know to be more humble, Claire. You can't go around this house as if a paycheck and a few contracts make you a real woman." That sentence was venomous. Not because it was unexpected, but because it had been prepared far too carefully. Eleanor had held that sentence in her mouth for a long time, honing it daily with contempt, and tonight she chose to use it because she believed I had nowhere left to stand. I didn't cry, didn't ask why, didn't look up the staircase to humiliate myself by confirming what was already too obvious. I simply reached into my coat pocket and lightly touched the edge of my phone, where the screen was face down, but the recording mode had been running since the moment I opened the front door. At 9:41 p.m., Michael came down the stairs. His shirt was misaligned by one button, the hair at the back of his neck still damp with sweat, and on his collar was a smear of berry-colored lipstick that didn't belong to me. Behind him was Vanessa Reed, his new assistant at his insurance company, clutching her jacket like a cheap prop. Michael didn't apologize. That detail helped me stay calm. When a person doesn't apologize, they've already chosen their position in the record. He looked at me with feigned weariness. "Claire, don't turn this into a tragedy." I asked, "This?" He exhaled as though I were an overdue invoice. "I didn't betray you. I just went looking for something you couldn't give me." Vanessa lowered her eyes for half a second, just enough to perform the role of the guilty woman. But when she looked up again, her gaze swept very quickly toward the master bedroom, as though she had already begun measuring whether my closet would have enough room for her things. She said quietly, "I didn't want to hurt you, Claire. It's just that Michael deserves to be happy." Eleanor smiled at Vanessa. Not the smile of a mother ashamed that her son had just destroyed a marriage, but the smile of a hostess welcoming a new daughter-in-law. She even reached out her hand and lightly touched Vanessa's wrist, as though the woman were a victim who needed protection from me. I looked at the three of them standing within the same frame, Michael in the middle, Vanessa behind his left shoulder, Eleanor seated beneath the pale yellow lamplight, pearl necklace around her neck, and her face full of self-satisfaction. They didn't know they had just created a perfect composition for future testimony. Michael crossed his arms. "You should leave the house tonight." I looked at him. "This house?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Don't act like you don't understand. This is the Whitmore family home. You only stepped into it with a marriage certificate, and you're stepping out of it with the truth that you never truly belonged here." I let that sentence sit undisturbed in the air. Didn't correct her. Didn't remind her that I had paid $148,000 for the first down payment. Didn't remind Michael that every mortgage payment over the past 3 years had gone through our joint account, most of the money in which came from me. I walked to the glass table and set my keys down. The sound of metal meeting glass rang out small, clean, sharp, like a punctuation mark. Eleanor looked at the keys with a satisfaction she could barely conceal. In her mind, this scene must have looked beautiful. The infertile daughter-in-law expelled from the house, the young lover standing behind her son. The Whitmore family finally reclaiming what they believed was theirs, because they had always confused possession with having the loudest voice in the room. Michael relaxed his shoulders. "Good. You're finally being reasonable." Vanessa pressed her lips together, but the corners of her mouth still curved upward. Eleanor raised her teacup once more, her eyes of victory fixed directly on me. She believed my silence was surrender. I smiled. Not broadly, not sadly. Just a small curve, enough for all three of them to see, but not enough for them to understand. "All right," I said. "I'll go." Before turning toward the door, I swept my gaze around the living room. The doorbell camera had recorded Vanessa entering at 8:12 p.m. The hallway camera had recorded Eleanor letting her in, and the smart speaker near the bookshelf was positioned perfectly to have captured every word she had just believed was a private insult. Eleanor called after me. "Claire, one final piece of advice. A woman who cannot bear children shouldn't try to hold on to a man through paperwork." I paused with my hand on the door handle. Outside, a cold wind blew through the porch of the house in Arlington, Virginia, making the brass wind chimes emit one thin sound. I turned my head and looked at her, the way a forensic examiner looks at a forged signature before sealing it into an evidence bag. "Thank you," I said. "A voluntary confession is always more valuable than testimony obtained under pressure." Eleanor narrowed her eyes slightly. Michael frowned. Vanessa didn't understand the sentence, but she finally had enough sense to stop smiling. I opened the door, stepped outside, and closed it behind me. They thought I had just left the house in defeat. In reality, I had just left 3 defendants at the scene. To understand what had just happened, you need to understand who they were and how completely they had misjudged me. They didn't begin betraying me at 9:38 p.m. in that Arlington house. That was simply the first time they were foolish enough to do it in front of the entire camera system I had personally paid to have installed. Michael Whitmore had always believed he was smart because he knew how to speak like a man with authority. He knew how to wear the right colored suit, how to smile at the right moment, how to place his hand on someone's shoulder at company parties as though he were bestowing a blessing. But Michael had one fatal habit. He signed everything at the last line. He never read the mortgage contract, never read the refinancing terms, never read the bank notifications, never even read emails with subjects written in all caps, urgent. Because in his mind, if something was complicated, Claire would handle it. Eleanor Whitmore was worse. She wasn't careless because she was busy. She was careless because she believed carelessness was the privilege of the wealthy. She believed the Whitmore name was a kind of immunity, believed that a pearl necklace, a beautiful home, a measured way of speaking, and a son in a suit could turn lies into truth. She didn't need to read paperwork because her whole life she had been accustomed to others bending down to pick up the consequences on her behalf. Vanessa Reed was the final architectural flaw. She was younger than me, louder than me, and dangerous in the way of someone who has never had consequences come knocking at their door. She didn't know how to hide her tracks because she believed being chosen by Michael was equivalent to being protected. The first time I learned Vanessa's name was at 11:17 p.m., 3 months earlier. Michael was in the shower, his phone lit up on the kitchen counter. The message had only one sentence. "Did she notice the lipstick on your collar?" I didn't pick up the phone immediately. I stared at it for 5 seconds, long enough to understand I was standing before a door. Then I took my own phone, photographed the screen from a distance, so that Vanessa's name, the timestamp, and the shirt with the lipstick stain hanging on the chair were all within the same frame. A normal wife might have rushed upstairs and pounded on the bathroom door. Someone in pain might have screamed. I opened my laptop, created a new folder, named it House Maintenance, and saved the first photograph into it. From that moment on, I was no longer investigating whether Michael was betraying me. I was only investigating how many people he would drag down with him. Eleanor walked into the record herself exactly 9 days later. At 6:42 p.m., during a dinner with 2 of her friends seated across from her, she set down her wineglass and looked at me the way one evaluates a defective item. "Claire," she said, "you should be grateful Michael stayed after all your bodily failures." The room went silent. One woman set down her fork. The other pretended to drink water. Michael didn't defend me. He didn't even look up. He just continued cutting his steak. Slowly, evenly, cleanly. As though the sound of the knife on the plate mattered more than his wife's dignity. That night, I learned the most important truth about my marriage. Michael wasn't silent because he feared his mother. He was silent because he agreed with her. I started recording after that. Not always because I needed evidence, sometimes only because I wanted to ensure that later, if anyone asked why I left, I wouldn't have to explain humiliation from the memory of someone who had been wounded. I had Eleanor's voice saying, "A woman who cannot bear children shouldn't ask for too much." I had Michael's voice saying, "Mom only states the truth in a slightly blunt way." I even had Vanessa's laughter in a voicemail she sent to the wrong number at 12:08 a.m. when she thought she had hung up. But they didn't know that. They watched me wash dishes, fold towels, reply to bank emails, and believed I was trying to hold a family together. No, I was keeping a chain of evidence intact. Their greatest mistake was thinking I was cold because I didn't know how to hurt. I knew how to hurt. I simply didn't spend my pain at the scene. I had worked 11 years in financial risk management. My job was to see disaster while it was still wearing a nice suit and using the word temporary. My job was to find the breaking point before the entire structure collapsed. And inside the Whitmore household, the breaking point lay in arrogance. Michael wanted to play the man who owned the house, but he couldn't remember where the first $148,000 had come from. Eleanor called it the Whitmore family home, but she had never seen the wire transfer records from my personal account. Vanessa said she would hold on to the curtains, but she didn't know that room had been paid for with the premarital funds of the woman she was laughing at. I had the mortgage contract. I had bank statements. I had property tax payment history records. I had emails Michael had forwarded to me with the note, "Can you handle this? I don't have time." I even had scanned copies of documents he had signed without reading. Among them, a few clauses that made my lawyer go silent for 3 seconds upon first glance. Those 3 seconds were worth a great deal. When a lawyer goes silent before a document, it's not because they don't understand it. It's because they've just seen a knife that already has a handle. Each of my files existed in 3 copies, one on my laptop, one on an encrypted hard drive at the office, One automatically sent to an email account Michael didn't know existed. I didn't keep them to threaten. Threatening is the work of someone short on evidence. I kept them so that when the right moment came, I wouldn't need to raise my voice. That was something the Whitmore family would never understand. They believed power was the ability to make others afraid in the living room. I knew that real power was the ability to make a bank, a lawyer, a county recorder, and law enforcement all look at one set of documents and arrive at the same conclusion. That evening, when I walked out of the house at 9:46 p.m., they thought I was carrying away defeat. In reality, I was carrying the audio recording of Eleanor voluntarily admitting she had let Vanessa in, Michael's voice confirming the affair inside the shared home, and Vanessa's voice transforming herself from the other woman into the most foolish witness in the record. They thought I had just walked away from a marriage. No. I had just left the scene so the evidence could rest undisturbed. And so they would have enough freedom to keep making mistakes. At 9:49 p.m., I sat in my car at the curb, exactly 3 houses east of the house. I didn't start the engine immediately because the sound of the motor might have prompted the porch camera to record that I was still nearby. I just locked the door, set my handbag on the passenger seat, then checked whether the most recent recording had automatically uploaded to the cloud. At 9:51 p.m., the first file appeared in the encrypted folder. The file name was Whitmore_admission_living room 9 to 38 p.m. I don't name files by emotion because emotion is of no use before a lawyer, a bank, or a judge who has heard far too many people say they didn't intend to. At 9:53 p.m., the doorbell camera sent a motion alert. Vanessa stepped out onto the porch, not to leave, but to retrieve a small bag from the back seat of her car. She had planned to spend the night in my home, on the same floor as my bedroom, under the protection of my mother-in-law. Eleanor appeared behind Vanessa, holding a glass of wine. She looked out at the dark street and smiled like someone who had just cleared the trash from their house. Then she spoke, clearly enough for the porch microphone to capture. "Don't worry, sweetheart. She won't come back tonight." At 9:55 p.m., I saved that video to a folder called Post-Removal Conduct. The folder name sounds dry, but that dryness was precisely what kept me calm. A video clip may be worthless if it only makes you hurt. It becomes a weapon when you place it correctly within a timeline. At 9:57 p.m., I sent the first email to my lawyer, Daniel Price, in Alexandria. The subject line contained only 5 words: Immediate Marital Asset Protection Review. Attached was a compressed file containing the mortgage contract, bank statements, property tax payment history, the audio of Eleanor's insults, screenshots of Vanessa's messages, and video from the porch camera. At 10:03 p.m., the living room camera activated. Michael opened a bottle of bourbon, the kind he had once said was too expensive for ordinary days. Vanessa sat on my sofa, legs curled up, her red shoes placed beside the glass table like a victory flag. Eleanor raised her glass. "Now we can finally breathe," she said. Then she turned to Vanessa, her voice lower but still audible. "By morning, Claire will understand she was never family." I didn't rewind that segment. No need. There are sentences you only need to hear once to know they will survive for a long time inside a case file. At 10:07 p.m., I logged into my personal bank account from my phone. I changed the password, enabled 2-factor authentication, and revoked Michael's access to the supplementary card I had issued him 2 years prior. No dramatic music, no thunderclap, just a blue button labeled Remove Authorized User, and my finger touched it very lightly. At 10:12 p.m., I called the bank's emergency support line to place a fraud alert on the joint account. I didn't freeze the account because adults don't act like they do in movies. I requested a risk notation, a limit on large transactions, and mandatory notification for any withdrawal above $500. At 10:18 p.m., the bank representative asked if I had a specific reason. I answered in the flattest voice I could manage. There is a possibility that marital assets are being used for purposes outside of the marriage, and I need to preserve the transaction history. She paused for half a second, then said, "I understand." People in the financial industry rarely need to hear more. They don't ask how much you're hurting. They ask which boundary was crossed, which accounts are at risk, and which transactions need to be flagged before they disappear beneath a polite excuse. At 10:24 p.m., I opened an invoice I had kept for 3 weeks. A $2,840 charge at a resort in Leesburg that Michael had once called a client retreat. The problem was that the supplementary receipt included 2 glasses of champagne, a couple's spa service, and Vanessa Reed's signature in the check-in section. At 10:31 p.m., I forwarded that invoice separately to Daniel with the annotation, "Possible dissipation of marital funds." I didn't know what the court would ultimately call it, but I knew that a husband who used joint funds to take his mistress to a spa would not enjoy seeing that invoice placed on a table in a room containing lawyers. At 10:39 p.m., Daniel responded. Not at length, not emotionally, just one sentence. "Do not return to the house tonight. Preserve everything. I'm calling you in 5 minutes." I looked at that line, and for the first time that evening, my shoulders dropped. Just slightly. Not because I was being rescued. I had never liked the feeling of being rescued. I only liked the feeling that a process had begun. At 10:44 p.m., Daniel called. I put the phone on speaker, set it on the dashboard, and made notes in the small notebook I always kept in the car. He asked 3 questions. Did anyone threaten you? Do you have a safe place to sleep? Does Michael have access to your personal accounts? I answered each question. No added drama, no retelling of how my heart had shattered, because a lawyer doesn't need to hear how your heart shattered. They need to know where the legal boundaries were crossed. At 10:52 p.m., Daniel asked me to send additional copies of documents relating to property ownership, contribution records, and the full history of mortgage payments. I opened my laptop in the car, connected to a hotspot, and transferred each file from the house maintenance folder to a second email. 76 PDF files left my machine like a convoy of vehicles with no sirens. At 11:08 p.m., the living room camera showed Vanessa walking around the house with a wine glass in hand. She stopped at my bookshelf, pulled out a book, looked at the cover, then replaced it in the wrong position. That detail was small to the point of absurdity, but inside me a door closed very quietly. At 11:14 p.m., Michael texted me, "Don't make this ugly. We can settle like adults." I looked at that message for a long time, not because I wanted to reply. I simply took a screenshot, saved it to the post-event communications folder, then locked my phone. At 11:21 p.m., he texted again, "You leaving willingly tonight will matter if this goes legal." I nearly smiled. A man who had just expelled his wife from their shared home, who then left written evidence that she had willingly departed, is the kind of person who saves lawyers from having to dig very deep. At 11:29 p.m., I forwarded both messages to Daniel. He replied exactly 4 minutes later, "Do not respond. Let him keep talking." That was the most beautiful sentence I heard that night. At 11:33 p.m., my phone notified me of a failed login attempt on my personal bank account. The IP address was located in Arlington. I looked at that alert for 2 seconds, took a screenshot, then forwarded it to Daniel with one sentence. "He just tried." Daniel replied almost immediately. "Good. That moves him from careless to useful. Preserve the alert." I read that and understood exactly what he meant. Michael had just crossed a new boundary on his own, moving from marital infidelity to conduct that could be viewed through a far more serious lens. At 11:41 p.m., I called the bank again. I requested additional security alerts, locks on all unrecognized devices, and a notation that a party with interest in the marital assets had just attempted unauthorized access to my personal account. The bank representative's voice became firmer after I read back the verification code. At 11:48 p.m., the hallway camera recorded Vanessa entering the master bedroom. She stood before my vanity table, picked up a bottle of perfume I'd bought in Boston, sprayed it on her wrist, then looked at herself in the mirror as though she were trying on a new life. Michael stood outside the doorway and didn't stop her. I saved that video clip to a separate folder named Unauthorized Access, Personal Space. Not because the bottle of perfume mattered, but because someone who confidently touches your belongings in front of a camera will usually feel confident lying about many other things. At 12:08 a.m., Vanessa called me by mistake. Perhaps she meant to call Michael, or perhaps she was drunk enough to find it amusing. I didn't answer, but the voicemail automatically recorded 17 seconds of laughter, the sound of Michael saying, "Leave it alone," and Eleanor's voice in the distance. Claire always needed to learn her place. I saved it. Didn't listen again. You only need to place a bullet inside an evidence bag once. At 12:19 a.m., I set my phone on the hotel desk near Roslyn, opened my laptop, and created a new timeline. Not a diary, not a confession. A legal timeline. Each time-stamped entry, each file, each witness, each statement. 8:12 p.m. Eleanor let Vanessa in. 9:38 p.m. I arrived home, began recording. 9:41 p.m. Michael and Vanessa appeared from the second floor. 9:46 p.m. I left the house after being asked to vacate the shared property. 10:03 p.m. They celebrated in the living room. 11:21 p.m. Michael attempted to create a false record that I had left voluntarily. 11:33 p.m. Failed login attempt on my personal account. 11:48 p.m. Vanessa entered the master bedroom and touched personal belongings. 12:08 a.m. Accidental voicemail confirming their attitudes and intentions. At 12:37 a.m., Daniel sent his third email. He had arranged an urgent meeting for 8:30 a.m. with a forensic accountant he trusted. The last line of the email read, "This is no longer just infidelity. This is documentation." I read that sentence twice. In the house in Arlington, they were probably still drinking, still laughing, still standing in my kitchen and talking about their future. They thought I was somewhere crying because I had been replaced. But at 12:41 a.m., I pressed send on the final email of the night. It contained the complete backup of all evidence, sent to the lawyer, the forensic accountant, and a backup email address that could only be opened with a physical security key. I had 8 hours and 49 minutes to transform the humiliation in the living room into a body of evidence that could not be denied. I slept exactly 3 hours. By 7:18 a.m., Michael sent the last text he would ever send as a man who still believed he controlled me. "Come home. We need to talk." He didn't know I had an 8:30 a.m. appointment. And this time, I wasn't going alone. The next morning, Daniel Price's office was cold, clean, and so quiet that the sound of paper sliding across the table surface registered like a deliberate act. I sat across from him, with Rebecca Holt beside me, the forensic accountant Daniel had called in overnight. She didn't ask if I was all right. She simply opened her laptop, looked at the timeline, and said, "This is clean." One sentence was enough. I didn't need anyone's sympathy. I needed a qualified professional to look at the wreckage of my marriage and confirm that it had structure. We didn't speak about betrayal. We spoke about accounts, ownership, contribution records, mortgage payments, tax history, and sums of money concealed behind names that sounded very legitimate. Last night's humiliation was disassembled into rows of transactions, signatures, emails, video files. Then Rebecca stopped. She zoomed in on a bank statement, turned the laptop toward Daniel, and the room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of silence from a skilled lawyer doesn't resemble surprise. It resembles the sound of a lock turning into the right groove. "Claire," Daniel said, "did you know Michael had been transferring money to an LLC in Fairfax?" I looked at the figure on screen. 3 transfers annotated as home repair deposit, totaling $18,600. But the mailing address for that LLC linked back to Vanessa Reed. I didn't blink. By that point, pain was no longer new information. Rebecca spoke very slowly. "If they call this home repair expenses, they'll need to explain why a woman without a contractor's license was receiving money through a newly registered LLC." Daniel removed his glasses and set them on the table. "This changes the room." That sentence made me understand we weren't merely preparing for a divorce. We were preparing a table. And at that table, the Whitmore family would have to look at what they had personally signed, personally transferred, personally spoken, and personally recorded. The first set of documents printed out wasn't very thick. Daniel deliberately didn't let me bring everything because someone who excels at ending a game doesn't throw their entire arsenal onto the table. They place only the precise round that makes the room understand where the rest is being kept. Inside the cream-colored envelope was a summary of the $148,000 from my personal account toward the down payment on the house. The $2,840 resort invoice in Leesburg with 2 champagne glasses, 1 couple's spa service, and Vanessa's signature at check-in. 3 transfers totaling $18,600 to the LLC connected to her. On top of it all, I placed a small black USB drive containing video, voicemail recordings, bank statements, text messages, the timeline, the failed login alert, and the audio recordings from the previous night. I looked at that envelope for a long time. The things capable of destroying a family sometimes weigh no more than a few dozen sheets of paper. Near noon, we returned to the house in Arlington. I stepped out of the car first, Daniel to my right, Rebecca behind me with her laptop and a second set of documents. No one rushed. No one made threats. And that calm was precisely what made everything so terrifying. Michael opened the door. He looked tired, but still maintained the old confidence of a man who had always believed that speaking more quietly meant winning. "Claire," he said, "you've finally agreed to talk." "I'm here to talk," I replied. His eyes moved to Daniel, then stopped on Rebecca. A very small crack appeared on his face. In the living room, Eleanor stood near the fireplace, still wearing her cream-colored cardigan and pearl necklace from the night before. She tried to maintain the posture of a hostess, but her right hand was gripping her left wrist. It was the small gesture of a person beginning to sense that the room no longer obeyed her. Vanessa sat on my sofa. She was wearing my gray cashmere sweater, the one I had bought in Boston and kept in the bedroom drawer. I looked at the sweater, then at her, but said nothing. Some insults don't need to be named. They only need to be noted. Michael closed the door behind us. Claire, you didn't need to bring strangers into family matters. Daniel didn't react, nor did Rebecca, because they weren't strangers. They were consequences with credentials. Eleanor stepped forward. You're blowing everything out of proportion. A mature woman should know how to preserve the dignity of the family. I looked at her and said, Last night you also spoke about family. I walked to the glass table where I had set my keys down the previous night. The faint ring left by Michael's bourbon glass was still visible on the surface. I placed the cream-colored envelope down in the center of the table, aligned with the edge of the glass, slowly and precisely, the way one places evidence before an interrogation. Michael looked at the envelope and gave a small laugh. What's this? A list of your injured feelings? I didn't look at him yet. I simply placed the small black USB drive on top of the envelope. The sound was very small, but everyone in the room heard it. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke at the volume of someone who knows with certainty that they hold the entire truth. I didn't come here to argue, I said. I came so that you could read before you speak. Vanessa looked at the USB. Eleanor looked at Daniel. Michael looked at me, and no one looked at each other anymore. That was the moment power left them, not with a shout, but with a small black object resting on a cream-colored envelope. Michael crossed his arms. Claire, are you trying to threaten me? I set my phone beside the envelope and said, No. Threatening is the work of someone short on evidence. I played the first audio recording. Eleanor's voice rang through the living room, clear and clean. Of course, I'm the one who let her in. No one moved. Vanessa looked down. Michael turned his head to look at his mother. Eleanor stood motionless, but the color on her lips faded very slightly. The recording continued. An infertile wife should know to be more humble, Claire. This time, the room didn't just go silent. It contracted. I stopped the recording before it could play further. There's no need to use an entire knife when the first cut has already gone deep enough. Eleanor's mouth opened, her voice thinner than before. You recorded me? I looked at her. You said it yourself. One sentence locked her mouth more effectively than any shouting could have. I opened the envelope and laid each sheet of paper on the table. This is the $148,000 from my personal account toward the down payment for this house. This is the mortgage payment history over 3 years. This is the $2,840 invoice in Leesburg that Michael called a client retreat. I placed the final sheet down. And this is 3 transfers totaling $18,600 into an LLC connected to Vanessa Reed, annotated as home repair deposits. Vanessa's head snapped up, her face shifting very rapidly from discomfort to fear. I didn't, Vanessa began. Rebecca spoke for the first time, her voice so flat it was nearly expressionless. You should let your lawyer finish that sentence for you. Vanessa closed her mouth. Michael snatched up one of the sheets, glanced over it too quickly to understand, then said, You have no right to drag my finances out in front of other people. Daniel stepped forward by half a step. This is marital property, not your personal finances, and you should be careful how you use the word mine. Eleanor struck the armrest of the chair. You do not stand in my house and speak to my son that way. Daniel turned to her, calm to the point of severity. Based on the ownership records, contribution records, and payment history, that is a declaration you should stop repeating. The air in the room seized. Eleanor had just lost her room. Not because I had shouted louder than her, but because for the first time in her life, someone had faced her with paperwork instead of politeness. Michael set the sheet down. Claire, we can resolve this privately. I looked at him, looked at Vanessa wearing my sweater, then looked at Eleanor trying to stand upright beneath the weight of her own words from the previous night. No, I said. Last night you wanted me humiliated in front of your mother and your mistress. Today you can do your reading in front of them. I placed one more page on the table, a transcript of the text. You leaving willingly tonight will matter if this goes legal. I also have this message, I said. Very helpful, thank you. The confidence on Michael's face didn't vanish immediately. It died slowly. First the smile, then the jaw, then the shoulders, and finally the eyes. Vanessa pulled my cashmere sweater sleeve down further, as though the fabric could conceal her name on the paperwork. Eleanor stood beside the fireplace, pearls still sitting perfectly at her throat, but nothing about her seemed elegant anymore. Michael stared at the USB drive as though it were a living thing. I placed my hand on the small black USB. Everything is here in full. Video, voicemail recordings, text messages, bank statements, timeline, the failed login alert, and the audio recordings from last night. No one answered. The silence in the room resembled a door that had just been locked from the outside. You may call your lawyers, I continued, still in a very quiet voice. In fact, I strongly recommend it. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Daniel stood behind my right shoulder. Rebecca opened her laptop. I looked at Michael, then at Eleanor, then at Vanessa. Now, I said, we're going to talk like adults. Michael's collapse didn't begin with shouting. It began with him staring at the small black USB drive for too long, as though if he looked at it carefully enough, it might transform into something less harmful. But the truth doesn't reshape itself simply because the guilty party isn't ready to face it. The color drained from his face first. Not the pallor of illness, but the pallor of someone who has just realized they left their fingerprints on every door. His jaw tightened, released, then tightened again, as though his brain was searching for a sentence that might save him. Eleanor took somewhat longer. She stood beside the fireplace, pearl necklace still lying perfectly at her throat. But the skin beneath her eyes had begun to sag like a mask softened by water. She looked at Daniel, then at Rebecca, then at the sheets of paper on the table, as though for the first time in her life she understood that paperwork could weigh more than social standing. Vanessa reacted the fastest. She pulled my cashmere sweater sleeve down, then immediately released it when she realized the gesture had drawn every eye to the sweater. Her lips parted, closed, then parted again, but no sentence safe enough to walk out of her mouth existed. It took 4 seconds for their minds to digest the truth. In the first second, Michael understood the affair was no longer simply an affair. In the second second, Eleanor understood that the phrase, "my house," had been nullified by paperwork. In the third second, Vanessa understood her name appeared in bank statements. The fourth second was the most beautiful. That was the second all three of them understood simultaneously that I hadn't come to hear explanations. I had come to notify them that the time for explanations was already past. The room sank into a silence with physical weight. It pressed down on Michael's shoulders, making his back bend slightly. It caught in Eleanor's throat, making her swallow dryly once, very quietly. It held Vanessa rigid on the sofa, both knees pressed tightly together like a child called to the principal's office. The air stopped moving. Even the sound of the heating system inside the walls became distant, as though the house itself understood it no longer belonged to the loudest voice in the room. I sat still, both hands resting on my thighs, watching the truth do its work. Michael was the first to try to save himself. "Claire," he said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it, "you're misunderstanding this." I didn't respond. Someone with evidence doesn't need to interject when the guilty party begins revising their own testimony. I simply looked at him, and that silence forced him to continue. "Vanessa doesn't know anything about the finances," he said. "She's not involved. That LLC was just a temporary arrangement to handle a payment. Rebecca looked at him over the edge of her laptop. You just said an uninvolved woman was receiving money through an LLC registered at her address? Michael went silent immediately. I watched the vein in his neck pulse once. Vanessa immediately shifted her tone. Michael told me that was his own money, she said quickly. I didn't know it was from a joint account. I didn't know Claire was paying for the house. Eleanor turned to Vanessa with eyes cold enough to nearly cut skin. 1 minute ago, she had regarded her as the woman suitable for her son. Now that the paperwork had appeared, Vanessa had become something that could be blamed. That girl must have seduced Michael, Eleanor said. She saw that our family had assets and attached herself to us. Vanessa turned sharply to face her. You were the one who opened the door for me. That sentence fell through the living room like a glass shattering on a stone floor. Eleanor stiffened. Michael closed his eyes for exactly half a second because he understood that the two women he had used against me had just begun turning their blades on each other. Daniel didn't smile. He simply wrote one line in his notebook. Sometimes punishment doesn't need anyone to declare it. It only needs someone with authority to be writing at the right moment. Eleanor attempted to reclaim her voice. Claire, I said things I shouldn't have. I was angry. Every family has moments of speaking too harshly. I looked at her. This was the second phase of those accustomed to control. When arrogance fails, they try on the costume of remorse. But Eleanor's remorse arrived at too convenient a moment to be called genuine. You weren't angry, I said. You were drinking tea. She blinked. A short sentence can silence a person if it returns them precisely to the scene. Last night there was no burst of anger. Only a woman sitting keeping watch, calm, composed, and cruel. Michael pulled out the chair across from me but didn't dare sit. We can fix this, he said. I'll end things with Vanessa. I'll talk to my mother. I'll do whatever you want. I looked at him the way you look at an account that has already been flagged as high risk. He wasn't remorseful for what he had done. He was remorseful that it had been recorded. No, I said. You want to do whatever it takes to keep this from going further. That landed. Michael's shoulders dropped another degree, and for the first time, he didn't try to correct his posture. The man who last night had told me to leave the house was now standing before me, trying to find a way to be permitted to remain inside his own story. Right at that moment, the doorbell rang. It wasn't police who entered first, but a process server standing on the porch holding a legal envelope. 2 Arlington officers stood a few steps back, calm, making no noise, present only to maintain order, called because of the report of the attempted unauthorized access to my personal account. Michael looked toward the door, then looked at me. In his eyes, the first fear was no longer being masked by anger. The phrase, family matter, had just died on his own doorstep. Eleanor whispered, Claire, what are you doing? I didn't answer. I didn't need to explain the process to someone who had spent an entire night believing the law applied only to other people. Daniel received the envelope, checked the name, then set it on the table beside the black USB. Michael started speaking very quickly. This is just a private matter. My wife is angry. She's trying to blow this out of proportion because I wanted a separation. One of the officers looked at him and said very calmly, Sir, we're here to document a reported unauthorized access attempt and to keep the peace. The phrase, keep the peace, sounds polite, but inside that room, it meant something simpler. They were no longer permitted to write their own rules. Vanessa stood up abruptly. I want to leave. Rebecca looked at her. You may leave after providing your contact information for your lawyer. Vanessa turned to Michael, waiting for him to protect her. But Michael didn't look back. That was the moment she understood. She had never been the one who was chosen. She had only ever been convenient until she became a liability. Eleanor sat down in her chair, not because she wanted to, but because her knees were no longer steady. She placed one hand over her pearl necklace, her fingers trembling very slightly. Last night, she had worn that pearl necklace as a symbol of class. Now, it only looked like something she was clinging to, so she wouldn't fall. Michael turned to me one final time. "Claire, please, don't do this in front of my mother." I looked at him. Last night, he wanted me humiliated in front of his mother and his mistress. Today, he wanted mercy, with the same audience watching him collapse. "I didn't choose the audience," I said. "You did." No one disputed it. That was the moment my marriage truly ended. Not when I saw the red shoes by the door, not when Eleanor called me infertile, not when Michael told me he had gone looking for what I couldn't give him. It ended when he looked around the room and understood there was no one left who could save him from what he had done. I sat still, didn't raise my voice, didn't cry, didn't tremble. I had imagined that revenge would be hot, would be red, would smell of fire. But real reckoning has the white of printed paper, the black of a USB drive, and the very small sound of a guilty person swallowing dryly as every door closes at once. Afterward, everything moved quickly in the way truth usually moves when placed at the right table. Michael called his private lawyer in a voice that trembled. Vanessa provided her contact information and left the house, no longer wearing my sweater. Eleanor didn't see her out. She sat beside the fireplace, pearl necklace still at her throat, but the air of refinement had left her before Vanessa even stepped through the door. People accustomed to using others as tools tend to forget those tools very quickly once they begin carrying risk. Michael tried to speak with me privately one more time. "Claire, please, I know I was wrong, but you didn't need to destroy everything." I looked at him. He still didn't understand that I hadn't destroyed anything. I had only stopped shielding what had already been rotting. "You did this yourself," I said. 3 words were enough. In the weeks that followed, the house in Arlington became disputed property. Michael had to account for the funds transferred to Vanessa's LLC, the resort invoice, the attempt to access my personal bank account, and every text message he had once believed was harmless. Michael's company also became aware of the matter through the legal process. A man who built his career on an image of trustworthiness doesn't need to lose everything in a single day. He only needs to lose his credibility in the right place, and the rest falls on its own. Vanessa resigned before she could be formally required to explain herself. Her LLC was scrutinized down to every line of its registration. The name she had once believed would help her step into a better life became the thing that pulled her into the record. Eleanor lost what she feared losing most, the right to speak without being held accountable. The charity luncheons, the tea gatherings, the stories of a distinguished family began to grow smaller. No one needed to publicly condemn her. It only took a few people knowing she had kept watch at the door while her son conducted his affair, and her polite world knew on its own how to step back. As for me, I didn't hold a celebration of victory, didn't post cryptic messages, didn't call friends to recount every detail with a tone of satisfaction. I did what needed to be done, signed what needed to be signed, and let the lawyers handle the rest. The first evening after everything was settled, I returned to the temporary rental apartment in Rosslyn. It was small, quiet, no pearl necklace, no bourbon glass, no sound of strangers walking through my hallway as though they had the right to be there. I took off my coat, washed my hands, then opened the cabinet and took out a packet of spaghetti. I boiled water, added salt, sliced garlic into thin pieces, heated olive oil in a small pan. The sound of garlic hitting the oil seemed so ordinary it felt strange. No background music, no tears, no collapsing on the floor the way people always imagine when a marriage ends. I simply boiled the pasta for exactly 9 minutes, tossed it with garlic, olive oil, a little dried chili, and Parmesan. Then I sat by the window, eating slowly, watching the headlights move across the Key Bridge. The phone vibrated once. A message from Michael. "Claire, please. I lost everything." I read it, placed the phone face down on the table, then rotated my pasta dish slightly to reach the remaining sauce. He was wrong. He hadn't lost everything. He had only lost the things that never should have been his through deception. I finished eating, washed the plate, dried the utensils, then brewed a cup of decaf coffee very slowly. The water flowed through the dark grounds, fragrant, warm, so ordinary it was almost merciless. I stood by the window, both hands cradling the coffee cup, and thought about the sentence Eleanor had once said, "A woman who cannot bear children should learn to be more humble." She was wrong. I didn't need to give birth to a child to prove my worth. I only needed to give birth to consequences for those who believed I had no right to exist. The most costly price never comes from revenge. It comes from the moment you insult the wrong person, the one who has already saved the receipts. I didn't need to destroy them. I only needed to place the truth in the right position, then let it do the rest.